If a company that's about to be compromised is using email addresses also as their login credentials for something like Active Directory, the ability for the hacker to know what the valid email addresses are and also identify which email addresses are not valid is going to bring that attacker one step closer towards the compromise of that company. So in this nugget, you and I get to discuss and then demonstrate a couple of different ways to do enumeration via Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. Let's start off by taking a look at some of the ports that are associated with email. For clients like Bob right here at this computer that's requesting emails from an email server, he's likely to be using either POP3 or IMAP. And the default ports for that are 110 and 143 respectively if it's plain text, or if they're using encryption services, it'd be 995 and 993 respectively. Now for outbound email, the protocol is SMTP, the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, and that's TCP port 25. And what an attacker may decide to do on the internet, let's say we have an email server or a relay agent of some type here on our DMZ. So the attacker is going to be communicating and working with the email server. If the attacker crafts some packets and sends in a request to see whether or not an email address exists, for example, let's say john@acme.com, assuming this is Acme just for a moment. If the attacker makes a request and the email server responds and says, nope, that email address doesn't exist, that hacker is now successfully going through the process of enumeration. On the other hand, if the attacker has a list of email addresses he wants to check, and the attacker is getting feedback from the email server saying, yes, this email address exists, or no, this email address doesn't exist, that's useful for the attacker, especially if the login name is going to be used as part of a login to something like Active Directory as well. The attacker also gets a benefit from sending in a request for a name that does not exist in email. And you might say, well, Keith, how's that going to help him? He's not going to get any positive information about an email address if that email address doesn't exist. However, the benefit is the attacker can see the devices involved on the network regarding processing that email message. Perhaps he can discover what the firewall is that's in the path, or the 1 or 2 relay agents that are being used in the company, all based on the feedback that's coming back when it's specifying that an email address doesn't exist. So as an example of enumeration using SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, let's use Telnet. And what we'll do with Telnet, instead of telnetting to the well-known port for Telnet, which is port 23, we can use Telnet to TCP port 25. And that way we can have a direct interaction with an SMTP server. And then if we start typing in SMTP-based commands, we can look at the responses that come back from that SMTP server. We also have some additional tools that we could use that could make that process more efficient and less tedious at the command line. And let's take a look at both of those methods right now. So on our Kali Linux box, let's bring up a command shell and let's do a quick ns lookup for smtp.cox.net. Just want to verify that I've got a SMTP server out there that I can work with just for a moment. And we're not going to do anything malicious whatsoever. We're just going to do a couple of simple queries. So smtp.cox.net at that address is a real SMTP server. So what could be done is a person could leverage Telnet and Telnet out to that address, and we can put in either the IP address or the DNS name because it's resolvable, smtp.cox.net. But instead of telnetting to the well-known port of 23 for Telnet, we can connect to the port 25, which the email server should be listening on. So we'll put 25 at the end, press enter, and now we are connected to an email server. Now the next question is, what can you do if you're connected to an email server? Well, we're going to want to be able to speak SMTP. So as far as SMTP commands, I just did a Google and found a Microsoft reference with several examples. We could use the hello or the extended hello commands used for a client to identify itself. We can specify the mail from, that's the sender of a message, the RCPT2, which identifies the destination or who the email is going to. If we scroll down a little bit further, there's additional commands like data, which is used to initiate the transfer of the email message itself. There's also a verify command, which verifies that a mailbox is available for a message delivery. So what we could do while we're connected to this server is we could go ahead and use some of those commands. For example, we could say HELO and press enter. It says, well, it requires a valid address. So let's type in HELO space and let's say ourtest.com. So the email server says, pleased to meet you. And this IP address right there is the IP address that I'm actually natting through as I'm going out to the public internet. So if we brought up a browser, for example, that shows my IP address, there it is at the moment. That'll change over time, but for this moment, that's what it currently is. And my Kali Linux box and everything else in my home lab as we're going out to the internet are coming from that IP address temporarily. So we get additional commands. For example, mail from, : and let's use bob@cox.net, press enter. And we could verify the recipient with rcpt to : and let's go ahead and use john@cox.net and press enter. And that exists too. So this is just an example of one method that might be used to help enumerate information based on an SMTP server communicating and talking with us. And there's several layers of defense that we could have with our SMTP server, including looking for bogus requests or malformed requests, or using specific authentication methods. And for things like spam, or where the attacker is going over and over and over again, we could use a concept called the tar pit. Now, if you think of a tar pit, what is that going to do? If there's a big dinosaur and it's going through a tar pit, it's going to slow them way down, if not completely. So if there's someone who's just doing hundreds or even thousands of requests, and we're using a tar pit approach, we could configure our SMTP server to have delays as it's communicating back and forth with the client/attacker. Because if an email takes, for example, a minute or so to actually be processed, that's not a showstopper regarding email in the real world. But if it's the attacker who's trying over and over again and not getting responses for a minute or a couple minutes for each request, that is absolutely going to slow them down. And the German word for tar pit is Teergrube. So I don't even have a German accent that I can use to throw on that. But if we're using a tier group approach or tier grouping, that's a process that we'd use to slow down an attacker, including spammers, because we'd cause them to wait for each and every request they're processing with our SMTP server. As an example of a tool that we could use that helps automate some of that, we could use a tool called SMTP user enum. So let's bring up a command shell and type in the command smtp-user-enum and press enter. And let me make this just a little bit bigger. So the command by itself is giving us examples of how we would use it, what the options are, and then a couple of examples down here as well. So if we wanted to use this, we could type in smtp-user-enum -m, and the M up here, the capital M, is for the method of username guessing. The default is verify, which may or may not be supported on the email server that you're connected to. That's why it's great to have additional options. So the method I'd like to use is the rcpt for the recipient. Then I'll do a -u, lowercase u, which is this bad boy right here. We're going to specify the username. Let's go ahead and do bob@cox.net space. Then let's do a -lowercase t to specify the host, referring to our SMTP server. So we'll do -t space, and then we'll put in smtp.cox.net. Or if we had an IP address of an SMTP server, we could put that in there as well, and we'll press enter. And this indicates that the user bob@cox.net does indeed exist. And instead of just checking on one user, we could use a list of users to do a whole bunch of checking in a very short period of time. In this nugget, you and I have discussed and demonstrated a couple of techniques that can be used to do enumeration leveraging Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.